Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. We appreciate you participating with us in this important program of the crisis in Israel. I'm Charles Pullman, and I'm here with my good friend, David Patterson. I'd like to just say a few words as an introduction of David. David is the Hillel A. Feinberg Distinguished Chair in Holocaust Studies at the University of Texas at Dallas. He has published more than 35 books, more than 240 articles, essays, and book chapters on a variety of topics, including, for us, the topics that we're going to discuss tonight. I am on the board of the Jewish Agency for Israel North American Council, but I'm here tonight in my individual capacity. I've been a member and an active participant in many organizations, including I formed and am the founder of my own organization called WhyIsraelMatters.net. I've been involved in Israel advocacy all my life, and I appreciate the opportunity tonight to discuss this with you. The purpose of this program tonight is not to serve as a rallying point for Israel. It is to provide you and others with a basic understanding of both the history of how we got here, the events that have occurred in the past, and to understand who the players are now that are threatening Israel and firing rockets or remaining silent on the border, watching what is happening. I personally, over the last 10 days since this crisis started, have been asked by a variety of people on the phone, out of town, in town, in different forums to help them understand what is going on. Because I am finding that people have a very lack of understanding. Either they had forgotten or maybe they didn't know. So the purpose tonight is to try and help impart information and facts to you so that you can help to evaluate for yourself. As I tell people many times when I speak before groups, as I do often, you're entitled to your opinion, you're just not entitled to your facts. The agenda tonight is David and I will each have about 20 minutes each in our respective presentations. We will then have a Q&A that will be by chat, where you go to the chat button and you click on questions for speakers. We will not be opening up the audio because it could become a little chaotic with people wanting to speak or take more time and prevent others. This session will be recorded and you will be able to watch it or refer it to others through the homepage of the Nishmatam. And I would like to thank the congregation of Nishmatam for hosting this important program tonight. They reached out quickly when it became apparent of the need to help educate people for what is occurring. So what I'd like to do at this time is just share with you some background information on Israel and the surrounding area. Unfortunately, this conflict that we're living today between Israel and the Palestinians is not new. Zionism started in the late 1800s with Jews primarily from Russia and other European countries moving to Israel because of pogroms and because of anti-Semitism and because of the conflict that was being waged on Jews. The land that the Jews settled on beginning in the late 1800s was purchased by the Jews from the Arab owners or from the Ottoman Empire. In 1922, the League of Nations adopted a legally binding resolution, adopting the Balfour Declaration and establishing the Palestine Mandate, which at the time is composed of what today we would call Gaza, Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan. And then shortly thereafter, England, who was awarded supervision of the British Mandate, spun off, you might say, Jordan to the Hashemite family. And what was left is what we have today as Israel and the West Bank. Israel today was established as a state, as the modern state of Israel in 1948. Its population today is over 9 million people, approximately 20% of whom are Arab citizens with full rights as citizens of the state of Israel. As I mentioned, after England partitioned off what is today Jordan, and at the time it was Transjordan, it left the area of what is today Israel and the West Bank. And even at that time, in the 20s and before, there was conflict between the Jews and the Arabs. There had been several attempts to partition this land between Israel and the Arabs, between the Jews and the Arabs. The first partition plan was in 1937, then in 47 by the UN, then in 67 after the Six-Day War, when Israel offered to return all the land that they had captured in exchange for peace. There was the Oslo Accords that were adopted in 1993 that basically went through 2000, although they're still in effect. President Clinton offered a peace plan in the year 2000. Former Prime Minister Olmert offered a peace plan. And in 20, President Trump offered a peace plan. Unfortunately, all of those peace plans were either rejected by the Arabs or there was no response. So we were left in this state of uncertainty. There have been several wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors, including the Palestinians. The first war was in 1947 that led to the establishment of the State of Israel when England withdrew from the British mandate and turned it to the UN, and the UN adopted a partition plan, and the Jews were attacked. As a result of that war, Jordan captured the West Bank, which was part of the British mandate, and Israel established its boundaries in what is current day Israel, except that the West Bank at the time that Jordan captured it included the West Bank today and also what is called East Jerusalem. In 1967, there was a Six-Day War. Israel was attacked by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, as well as the Arab countries. Israel launched a preemptive strike, took out the Air Force of Egypt, and as a result of the war, captured the West Bank, all of Sinai, and the Golan Heights. There have been wars in 1973 between Israel and Syria and Egypt that was alleged as it was a surprise attack. There was an 82 war when Israel went into Lebanon to try to eradicate the terrorists. Then in 06, which they call the Second Lebanese War with Hezbollah. There's been 3 wars with Hamas in Gaza, beginning in 08, in 2012, in 2014, and now what we're witnessing today. And during all this time, since 07, when Hamas took over control of Gaza, there had been a continuous stream of rockets. Israel's about the size of New Jersey. It's 71.5 miles wide at one point and as narrow as 9 miles in another, and is 260 miles long. Not very large. In fact, President Bush, one time when he was governor of Texas, went to Israel, took a helicopter tour with then Prime Minister Sharon, and made the comment, Mr. Bush did, that Mr. Bush has friends who own ranches whose driveways were longer than the state of Israel. The distance is important to understand because today we see coverage of rockets being launched from Gaza into Israel, and for the first time reaching further into Israel than in previous. Tel Aviv is 41 miles from the northern boundary of Gaza. Jerusalem is 47 miles, Eilat is 130. If you live on the border with Gaza in the Israeli side of the border, you can live within a mile or less of the border. And Sderot, which takes the brunt of a lot of the rockets, is within 8 miles. Over the years, the attacks that have been launched by Hamas and the Palestinian PLO against Israel have comprised a variety of methods that they have used. In addition to the wars by the armies, there have been rockets, tunnels, mortars, fire balloons, knifings, car rammings, drones, electric warfare, suicide terrorists, and vests. And each time, Israel has had to adjust in order to meet the challenge that has been waged against Israel in this continuous war against the Jewish state. Israel has used human intelligence, electronic intelligence, and technology. They developed the Iron Dome with the assistance of the United States that became active in 2011. And now, because of prior wars, we can see that the precision of the Iron Dome and its effectiveness against the rockets is almost 90% for those rockets that are projected to land into populated areas, and to stop the suicide bombings, the suicide terrorists who would walk across from the West Bank into Israel and go into a facility, into a restaurant, into a bus, and blow themselves up with a suicide vest. Israel had no choice but to build a security fence or a wall in order to protect itself from these terrorists. In addition to these types of arms that has been used against Israel, there is also a campaign waged against Israel. One of the efforts against Israel today is what's called BDS, which stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. That campaign, which originated and is run from Ramallah and now has spread to other parts of the world, including the United States, is a campaign to cause a boycott of Israel, not just economic, not just military, but in all forms, whether it be academic or in the arts, to impose sanctions against Israel through the UN, and to cause companies that are doing business with Israeli companies to divest from those companies. The UN Human Rights Council issues the majority of their resolutions condemning Israel for acts that are committed not by Israel but by other states, but are not recognized. The UN General Assembly has passed resolutions condemning Israel. There's a propaganda campaign that is being waged against Israel. There's the media that in some cases, in many cases, has adopted a certain point of view without being necessarily fair or balanced, that David will talk about. And there are several organizations, some of which are explicitly anti-Zionist and anti-Israel, but who claim to be Jewish, including Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now. There's an organization, Students for Justice in Palestine. These are all US organizations that originated in California. There are certain organizations that claim that they're pro-Israel and pro-peace and pro-Palestinian, but whose pronouncements and emails only attack Israel, which is J Street. There is, unfortunately, in the BLM organizational charter, specific statements condemning Israel as committing genocide and apartheid and calling for the divestment and cut off of funding to Israel. And unfortunately, we're seeing today a small segment of the Democratic Party and certain members of Congress whose motive and whose rhetoric is extremely harsh, critical, and harmful to the state of Israel. But all is not bad. There is good within the history. In 1979, Israel signed a peace treaty with Egypt, and that peace treaty exists today, and as a result of that treaty, Israel gave back Sinai. In 1995, Israel signed a peace agreement with Jordan that still is maintained. In 1993, with the auspices of the United States and President Clinton, Israel and the Palestinian Authority signed the Oslo Accords that were intended to result in a Palestinian state, but unfortunately, despite President Clinton's heroic efforts in 2000 and 2001 to bring it to fruition, didn't happen because then Mr. Arafat would not reach an agreement. Israel withdrew totally from Gaza that it had captured in '67, in 2005, and in some cases had to forcibly remove Israelis from Gaza. And what did Israel get in return from the withdrawal from Gaza in '05? An unending barrage of rockets that continues to this very moment. In 2020, President Trump brought his peace plan that ultimately resulted, I think, in what we now call the Abraham Accords. And those accords have now established, for the first time, normalization of relations between the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, and Oman. No one had expected it. Had you asked, what is the chances of Israel normalizing relations with a Muslim Sunni country prior, they would have said no way. But it's happened. And even in this conflict that we've now experienced for the 10th day, those countries that had normalized relations with Israel pursuant to the Abraham Accords, they have expressed their dissatisfaction with the current crisis, but they have not disengaged with Israel. And that is a hopeful sign that Israel will be able to normalize relations with other Arab countries, because quite frankly, they now have a common enemy, and that enemy is Iran, which is Shia. And we can see Iran's hand throughout the Middle East, whether it's in Lebanon or Iraq or Yemen or Syria or Gaza or even the West Bank. We see it, and they now have a common enemy. Israel innovations come out of benefiting mankind day by day, every day, to make all of us safe. You can't use your cell phone if it weren't for Israeli innovations. When there's a crisis in the world, Israel's the first to send aid. There are positive things happening in the last 10 days, though, have sort of cast this sadness over what's occurring in the Middle East. The death on both sides is tragic. We all wish and pray that it would stop. But for reasons that aren't always what is described in the media, it seems to be ongoing. But maybe within the next few days, there will be a peace, not a peace, a ceasefire. But as in prior conflicts between Israel and Hamas, the ceasefire doesn't last, it's not permanent, it's just sort of a respite, or what in some Muslim countries they call a hudna. So that's sort of a background. And the reason why I add that, and I know it's a lot of information, is to remind people that when someone asks you what is happening, this conflict didn't start yesterday. It's been going on, and there have been repeated, nonstop, increasing efforts to attack Israel and to destroy Israel. And if you have a doubt about the intention of the terrorist organizations of Hamas and the PLO and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad, then I turn it over to my good friend David, who's going to provide us with the information we need to know so we can respond to our friends with those questions that they ask us. David.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. That was intensely informative and helpful. And becoming informed is a challenge with regard to the current situation, because there's very little effort to inform audiences in the mainstream media. You can dig for information, but you have to do some digging. Part of it has to do in the media with the language of the media. The language of the media is often delegitimizing when speaking of Israel, sometimes demonizing. For example, when you read headlines in the New York Times, Washington Post, with the BBC, often the headlines will say something about Israel strikes again, Israel targets this target, Israel Air Force goes into Gaza and hits these buildings. They took down, for example, the Al Jarrah Tower. And this is reported as Israel attacking the Associated Press offices. The Associated Press had offices in the building, as did Al Jazeera. But the offices that were the target were 3 Hamas offices in that building. One housed the Hamas military intelligence, the other housed their research and development personnel, and the third, their high-tech personnel. That was the target. And if you saw the building come down when it was hit, it was quite devastating. The building was destroyed, but there were no casualties. How do you bring down a building like that with no casualties? Because the Israelis bend over backwards, do everything possible to avoid civilian casualties, whereas Hamas targets only civilians and sending rockets indiscriminately into Israel. There was, the story of Sheikh Jarrah, which was a neighborhood in Jerusalem involving a dispute between corporate landlords and tenants. They went to court. Court ruled that the tenants have to pay rent or vacate. Next thing you know, Palestinians are rioting. Now, what should have been just another court case decision between tenants and landlords became such a flashpoint, I think, for several reasons. Several elements came together to form this storm. First of all, we just observed the anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem Day. From the 6-Day War, when Jerusalem was reunified under Jewish control since for 2,000 years. You also have the month of Ramadan coming to an end, holy month. Ramadan is a month of fasting, purification, returning to the relation to Allah. For the jihadists, Ramadan is a busy month very often, because for jihadists, I'm talking about various groups that stem ultimately from the Muslim Brotherhood founded in 1928, okay? Most of the jihadist organizations in the world come out of the Brotherhood, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But for the jihadists, this is a time to spill blood or have your blood spilled, okay? Our greatest desire, says the Brotherhood credo, is to die in the path of Allah. Plus you have Mahmoud Abbas, who is now in his 17th year of a 4-year term, okay? He's decided, okay, we're gonna have elections because there's a lot of internal unrest in the West Bank, less in Gaza because Hamas hammers people who show any sign of dissent, and I mean in a bloody fashion. Hamas is on the rise in the West Bank. I think, in my view, Abbas was worried at the age of 85 that Hamas might take power away from him. They might have enough support from the Palestinian people. So I think Hamas makes its move to emerge, to rise as the defender of the Palestinian people, and thereby marginalize Fatah, which is the terrorist militant arm of the PLO, Palestinian Authority. Okay. So you got that in the mix. And then another element here that contributes to it is Iran. Iran, now that they're sitting at a negotiation table, is in the process of regaining its legitimacy on the world stage. Hamas is supported by Iran, as is Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a spinoff from the Islamic Republic of Iran, has its own history. Hamas is a spinoff from the Muslim Brotherhood, but they are both backed by the Iranians, and in my view, their actions are coordinated. Hezbollah is watching very carefully what's happening with Gaza. Hezbollah has over 100,000 rockets of their own in the north, so they're located in southern Lebanon. So I think these are some of the immediate names. Charles mentioned the Abraham Accords, and the Palestinian cause, so-called, has been increasingly marginalized as the relations between Israel and the 5 Muslim countries that Charles mentioned improve. They become even more marginalized. So this puts them back on the map. But so those are the immediate names. But in order to understand the nature of the conflict, we have to understand something about the ultimate aim. And to understand that, you have to understand a little bit about the origin of Hamas and PLO. Where do they come from? Where do they come from? Both organizations can trace their origins to the Muslim Brotherhood, a modern jihadist movement, self-described as jihadist, founded in 1928 in Egypt. The founder was Hassan al-Banna. In the 1930s, the Brotherhood developed relationships with the Nazis thanks to the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini. Okay. Haj Amin al-Husseini would prove to be pivotal in these connections between PLO and Hamas and the Brotherhood. Al-Husseini had his first meeting with the Nazi German consul in Jerusalem in 1933. In 1937, he had to flee Palestine because he was wanted for inciting the Arab revolt. Over the next few years, he was on the Nazi payroll. He turned up in Berlin in November 1941. Okay. It's a famous picture of him sitting with Hitler. And in his course of working with the Nazis, Al-Husseini, working with Heinrich Himmler, organized several SS killing units that consisted entirely of Muslims, mostly from the Balkans. The most infamous one was the Hanshar unit, had about 22,000 men. So Al-Husseini is a war criminal. Al-Husseini turns up in Egypt in 1946 to be greeted by the Brotherhood. And he had connections with the Brotherhood before, but now his connection is solid and official. Within about 3 months of turning up in Egypt, he brings his young protege, Yasser Arafat, under his wing. So Arafat had his initial indoctrination and training from the Brotherhood. In 1959, Arafat organized Fatah. Fatah came before the PLO. In 1959, Gaza is part of Egypt. East Jerusalem, West Bank is part of Jordan. There's no Golan Heights. Right? The Golan Heights belong to Syria. There were Golan Heights. There's no settlers, no settlements. And yet Fatah is organized as a self-described terrorist organization, under the guidance of Haj Amin al-Husseini. Arafat is working. Mahmoud Abbas, the current head of the Palestinian Authority, has his relations with Arafat at that time. So you can see from al-Husseini to Arafat to PLO, you can see a line of connection there. The charter of PLO which was drafted after soon after their formation, and the organization was formed in 1964. At that time, in preparing the charter, Arafat declared, "We don't want peace. We want war. For us, peace means the destruction of Israel and nothing else." So the PLO charter in Article 14, you see the charter framing the struggle as an existential struggle, as a battle between good and evil. Either we prevail or we die. And prevail means the destruction of Israel and nothing else. Article 15 of the charter says the PLO exists for the sole purpose of destroying the Jewish state. The sole purpose. That's the ultimate aim. Article 20, in order to delegitimize the Jewish people, declares that the claims of historical or religious ties of the Jews to Palestine are completely false. They were never there. There's no religious connection, no historical connection of the Jews to the land. So this, you have a couple of examples from the PLO charter. Hamas also can trace its origins through al-Husseini to the Brotherhood. In fact, Hamas identifies itself as a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas was formed in December 1987, later than the PLO, during the first Intifada. They saw an opening to organize. Their founding figure, Ahmed Yassin, was a devotee of Haj Amin al-Husseini. So this is very interesting. You got between Yasser Arafat and Hitler, just one person. Hitler's tied to al-Husseini, al-Husseini's tied to Arafat, al-Husseini's tied to Yassin. And the ideology of extermination is very close, very similar. Hamas, as a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, cast the struggle against the Jews in religious terms, religious extremist terms. As Haj Amin al-Husseini said, killing Jews pleases Allah. Killing is a form of praying. The blood of a Jew will buy you a place in paradise. Okay. So it's not a political issue. It's not reducible to a political issue. One of the things that characterizes jihad is that religion and politics are inseparable. Okay. Ahmed Yassin said, the founder of Hamas, there is no distinction between Jews, Zionists, and Israelis. Okay. The enemy is the Jew, not the Israelis. And this is something they state quite explicitly. In their charter, Hamas, which Hamas calls the Charter of Allah, suggesting that Hamas is Allah. The word of the charter has the authority of Allah. In fact, the charter invokes three texts to demonstrate the truth of its claims. One is the Quran. Second is the Hadith, which is a body of Muslim sacred texts from their oral traditions. And the third sacred text is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a notorious forgery, supposedly minutes taken by the leaders of world Jewry plotting to take over the world. Article 13 of the Hamas charter says that to ask a Muslim to negotiate peace is to ask them with Israel, with the Jews, is to ask a Muslim to abandon Islam. They can't do it without becoming apostate. Right? They have an absolute imperative to obliterate the Jewish state and the Jewish presence in the world. So Article 15 ends with the refrain from the Hadith, I will assault and kill, assault and kill, assault and kill. Article 18 says it's the duty of a good Muslim mother, a good mother, to raise her children and prepare them for the role of fighting, for the path of jihad that awaits them. That's a good mother. Article 22, following more of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, claims that the Jews control world governments, world banks. The article states that there is not a war in the world without the Jews having their fingers in it. Kill the Jews and there'll be no more war. So you see, the thinking here is not that all Jews are evil. No, it's that all evil is Jewish. This becomes almost an apocalyptic battle. And if you read the charter, you see these things of the, of the last days as days of warring with the Jews. Now, it's not, again, when you say Jews, what are you saying? Article 28 says we're talking about Jews, Israel, and Judaism. Jews, Israel, and Judaism. Therefore, Jews everywhere have to be targeted. You can find on YouTube Yahya Sinwar. Yahya Sinwar is the current head of Hamas. I bet you most of you didn't know that, because if all you watch is the media, you don't know who's the head of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar. You don't know that Khalid al-Bach is the head of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But if you know Netanyahu is the leader of the Jewish state. But Sinwar says he calls upon Palestinians in the diaspora, the 7 million Palestinians throughout the world, to kill Jews wherever they find them. And this is something that has to be taken seriously, and including in places like Dallas, Texas. So the Jews plan to take over the world. The Jews represent a satanic presence in the world. They are as invisible as Satan. And again, it's a religious duty to oppose the Jews. And I'll end with one example that illustrates this. It's got nothing to do with the Jewish presence in Palestine. In 2007, one of the Egyptian Salafist sheikhs, his name Mohammed Hussein Yaqub, in a television broadcast, you can see this on YouTube as well. He says, if the Jews left Palestine, would we stop hating them? Of course not. We would hate them if they didn't occupy anything. We would hate them because they are evil. And according to Yaqub, he says that the Quran teaches us to hate them. We will hate the Jew for all of eternity until there's not a single Jew left on earth. That's the ultimate aim of what you see with the rockets going out of Gaza. You've got these but that's the ideology, that's the thinking that drives it. That's why the negotiating is so near impossible, if not impossible. You can't negotiate with a person who thinks his salvation is tied to his fighting and is spilling your blood and spilling his own blood. So while standing on one foot, that's a brief background to what's going on. Maybe we should talk a little bit.
Let me just share with you something on a personal nature. Everything David has said, and I encourage you to read the entire PLO charter and the entire Hamas charter. For example, there's one line in the Hamas charter that says, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam abolishes it. The PLO charter starts out saying, Palestine, with the boundaries that it had during the British Mandate, is an indivisible territorial unit. And you remember at the beginning of this program, I tried to share with you what the British Mandate was. I'm sorry I didn't have a map. It goes on for there. Both charters and the Hezbollah, which David didn't talk about, which is another terrorist organization dedicated to the destruction of Israel and the killing of Israelis. And quite frankly, these rockets, by the way, that come out of Gaza and Syria now and Lebanon, they are not picking who they land on. They can land on Jews and they can land on Arabs. And in fact, Arabs have died and have been hurt. But it is difficult for us, I will offer to you as citizens of America and members of the Western civilization, to get our head around what is in these two charters and what David has said. How else can you explain a mother celebrating their child being a suicide terrorist, wrapping themselves in a vest and blowing themselves up? We're dealing with the Middle East, and you cannot judge the Middle East by Western civilization standards. They don't operate the same way. We don't have time to go into it. In terms of the current conflict, I just want to make a couple of comments and then we'll go into Q&A. As of today, since May 10th, when this started, over 3,700 rockets have been fired into Israel. More have landed inside of Gaza and injured or killed or maimed people in Gaza too. Hamas claims, and the Western media is repeating, that the conflict now that we see arose out of Israeli security forces that went up to the Temple Mount, went into the Dome of the Rock or Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood issue. Even assuming that's right, even assuming there is a legitimate basis for both claims, neither one justifies launching 3,700 rockets. Now it's over 4,000 rockets. Neither one. You know, in the West, we resolve conflict by compromise. I tried to share with you through the partition plans that have been presented, even as of last year when Trump offered his, Abu Mazen with the PA just said, I'm not talking to you, he even said it before. So what has Israel done? They've developed the Iron Dome. I had a young 10-year-old young man call me from another city to ask me, why doesn't Israel just go into Gaza and wipe them out? The answer is because Israel isn't looking to either injure or harm their own soldiers or the Palestinians. And what Israel does, when, as David mentioned, when they identify a building in Gaza that is being used by Hamas to wage this war, Israel calls every resident of that building on their cell phone to tell them the building's going to be destroyed, you need to leave. And then they drop, before the bombing of the building, what I call like knockers, little like pucks, onto the roof to tell them it's going to happen. That's why with regard to that building with the AP and Al Jazeera, there were no casualties. Israel's doing everything possible to minimize injury and death. Hamas's rockets that are being fired against Israel is a war crime. They are being fired at population centers indiscriminately, and if Israel didn't have the Iron Dome, which they didn't have in 2006, when I was in northern Israel during the war with Hezbollah, there would be a lot more casualties. Israel is protecting its people. Israel's campaign today in Gaza is to wipe out the underground infrastructure tunnel that Hamas has built to house its fighters, its terrorists, its armaments. But why doesn't Hamas allow the Palestinian people into those tunnels for safety? Of all of the aid that has been given to Gaza and Hamas over the years, just do your own research to see how many new hospitals, schools, and roads have been built. Janine and I, several years ago, were in a Hamas tunnel that extended from Gaza into Israel. It is a war, and it's not a war about two states. It's not a war about finding a solution. It's a war about eradicating Israel. What's happening today? Why is Hamas continuing? They're testing the Iron Dome. Israel's responding by really sending a message, I believe, from what I've read and heard, to Hezbollah, to Iran, to ISIS, that if you do the same thing that Hamas is doing, you're going to get the same consequences. And in fact, this morning, 4 rockets were fired from Lebanon into Israel. When Janine and I were in Israel in 2014, we met with security and military people, and we were told in 14 that Israel was preparing for a 3-front war simultaneously on Gaza, Syria, and Lebanon. I sometimes wonder, in watching what's happening today, if that is possibly happening. That the rockets are coming from Gaza, Hezbollah is testing Israel in the north, and Iran and Hezbollah, which Hezbollah is in Syria too, are watching. What we hear is the reason for this is not accurate. It was an excuse to launch a war against Israel to test its capabilities. And Israel is responding. What Israel is doing is sad. We wish it wouldn't happen. We don't celebrate death of anybody, unlike many of the Hamas and the terrorists who do celebrate the death of Jews. But we're in this struggle. Just today, Israel had arranged to admit a 24-truck caravan carrying humanitarian supplies into Gaza from the checkpoint, from the Gaza border, from Israel into Gaza. Somebody from the Gaza side launched rockets against the convoy, and only 4 trucks got through. And unfortunately, we also see today what really is probably a more serious problem. And that is, in some parts of the state of Israel, we see a flare-up in the relations between some Jews, some Israeli Jews, and some Israeli Arabs. Now, we saw that back in the year 2000 at the beginning of the Second Intifada. I know many Israelis thought that maybe that had gone. I've met with Israeli Arabs. I understand, I empathize with their concerns, but they're not looking, with the Israeli Arabs I met, to leave Israel. We don't see a flood trying to get into the Palestinian Authority. And the Israelis are concerned, and they need to figure out how to work it out with the Israeli Arabs, because here are citizens of the same state. So that's a high level. I'm sorry that we gave so much facts, so much information. It's like drinking from a fire hydrant. But this conflict has been going on, and it's multifaceted, and it is complex. And we who support Israel have to be prepared to answer questions from our friends, our acquaintances, our colleagues, when they ask for our help in understanding. It is not adequate to say, I'm sorry, I wish I could help you, but I don't understand myself. We lost, and the person who's trying to learn has walked away empty-handed. I'm not suggesting you become Professor Patterson, but there is a basic level of knowledge that you should attain. And with that, we'll open it up for some questions. I'll read them and let David answer them. So, where are we starting? Why do Arabs want to kill their own people? I've seen many pro-Palestine propaganda videos go viral on social media. this week, how can we combat the quick spread of anti-Semitism on social media? I'll give an answer to let David. David actually is the expert on anti-Semitism. He lectures worldwide. It is quite an honor for me to be sitting here with him, participating in a program. I understand I'm not a participant in social media, but young people I know have told me they're getting that the social media is lit up from both sides, and they don't know how to interpret. One of the problems today is that many people get their information from social media, which is not only truncated in sound bites, but it may not even be accurate. How do we deal with it? I don't have an answer for you. I do know that we all see a rise in anti-Semitism. It is a concern, and it's something that we're going to have to deal with, and I'll let David see if he can come up with a better answer of how do we fight this quick spread of anti-Semitism on social media.
How do you fight it on social media? Well, the most problematic sector of the spread of anti-Semitism on social media and in other institutions, in political institutions and academic institutions, is that anti-Semitism has taken fashionable and even morally required forms. As Israel is demonized, as whatever evil is the going evil of the day is tagged on Israel: apartheid, racist, human rights violators, colonialists. More and more, the moral requirement is to dismantle the state. So the morally required anti-Semitism that we see, and this is throughout social media, and as I said, many places in academia, many political institutions, to be considered moral, you have to oppose the existence of the Jewish state, which leads you to be more inclined to sympathize with Hamas than with the Israelis. So that's a very dangerous and insidious form of anti-Semitism. The part of the question was asked about Arabs killing Arabs.
Why do Arabs want to kill their own people?
One of the Arabs are Hamas. Let's say Arabs. We'll say Hamas. In this case, they are perfectly willing to kill their own people if it will promote the cause of jihad, which is, in this case, the extermination of the Jewish state and ultimately the Jewish people. Okay, so when you read that that 15% of the rockets launched in Gaza fall in Gaza and kill their own people, those people are regarded as martyrs. They're holy. They're in paradise. Their blood has been spilled, not just for political war, military war, but for a holy war. Their blood is sanctified. It's a sanctification of Allah.
And it's fodder for the media.
And it's, well, that too. I mean, it buys them a lot of media time and media sympathy, right? And it is about the Jewish people. Let me say once more, when the head of Hamas, Sinwar, puts out the word to the Palestinians in the diaspora, kill Jews everywhere you find them on earth, many of them take that seriously. When Charles read the line from the Hamas charter, Israel will exist until Islam wipes it out, that statement was made by Hassan al-Banna before the establishment of the Jewish state. So he's talking about the people of Israel, not the country. The country, the Israelis, the Jewish people, these are all one and the same in the minds of these.
So we have another question that says, Netanyahu responded to Biden's call for a ceasefire today by saying the campaign would continue until the objective is met. Do you know what that objective is? I'm not trying to be smart aleck, but Mr. Netanyahu didn't call me today and tell me. The IDF doesn't usually announce, but I think that it is to destroy as much of the Hamas military infrastructure so that Israelis can live in peace for some extended period of time. It's the same thing that has occurred in prior campaigns between Israel and Hamas, but this is the first time Israel has not sent troops into Gaza. They've done it by air through precision-guided missiles. And I will tell you from personal knowledge, Israel knows what goes on in Gaza. They have real good eyes in the sky. How long it will take, and we also don't know what Iran is doing in the background that Hamas is engaged with and that Netanyahu knows about. Because I would feel very confident that Israel has a lot of intelligence that they're maybe sharing with the US, but not with the public. Israel has no reason or incentive to continue a war any longer than they need to, but they have an obligation to their citizens that they live in peace and security. And the rockets, the firebombs, the attempt to breach the fence on the Gaza border is causing such misery among the children on the Gaza border that Janine and I have been there. We've been with the counselors. We've been in the hospitals. It has to stop. And maybe there will be a solution one day, but unfortunately it doesn't appear now. So do we have any more questions? Hello?
I can just
Please.
comment on what you just said.
Please.
When will it be resolved? When will it become to a closure? In this case, what worries me is what we touched upon earlier, is that Iran is watching all of this very closely. Hezbollah, which is a proxy of Iran, watching very, very closely. Iran has been launching drones into Israel from Syria and southern Lebanon, testing that airspace. What worries me is that the Iranians are viewing this as an exercise to help them prepare for something bigger from Hezbollah in Syria.
Iran will use proxies.
Yeah, yes.
So we have a question. I'll let my good friend David. Is Hamas a Jewish problem?
Hamas is a problem to the Jews because exterminationist Jew hatred is as fundamental to what defines Hamas as it is to what defined the Nazis. You cannot be an adherent of this terrorist organization, Hamas, without being devoted to the extermination of the Jews, starting with the Jews that live across, that live in Israel. So Hamas is a problem for the Jews. Hamas again, this is a religious imperative. It's not an ethnic battle. The Hamas jihadists are not racist. They don't see the Jews as an inferior race. No, they see the Jews as satanic. They're no more part of a race than Satan belongs to a race. I know this is difficult to get our conceptual hands on, but Hamas, I don't know if it's a Jewish problem, but they're a problem for the Jews. They're not going to go away. They're not going to go away.
And I would also offer that Hamas is a world problem.
Yeah.
Because Hamas is a terrorist organization that is being run by Iran. Iran is looking to see how the world responds to Hamas.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just an Israel problem. You know that saying, the Jews are the canary in the mine. Israel may be on the front lines, but Europe and other countries are also at risk and need to be paying attention to what's happening. So Hamas is not just a Jewish problem. It is a problem for us. It's not just an Israeli problem. It is a world problem. Yeah. And the sponsor of Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and the organization in Yemen, the Houthis,
yeah.
They have one thing in common. Their sponsor is Iran. You might remember a couple of years ago, Iran launched, missiles, drones were launched from Yemen into Saudi Arabia attacking the oil fields. That isn't because Yemen has the resources to buy drones. They were Iranian supplied. It's unfortunate, in my opinion, that our government, current government, doesn't recognize the threat that Iran poses to the world. Really, the question is Hamas a Jewish problem? Is the same question as asking, is Iran a Jewish problem?
It's a human problem.
The answer is no. There's a question here of whether the majority of the populace in the West Bank support Hamas, and if so, why? I don't have any information that I can think of a survey, but Hamas is gaining a foothold in the West Bank. That's part of what is driving this current conflict. Hamas wants to oust Abu Mazen, who's the president of the PA. The reason why, in my belief, that Abu Mazen canceled the election is not because Israel said that the Palestinians in East Jerusalem can't vote. It's because Abu Mazen was afraid he'd lose. When Gaza had their election in 2005, actually the PA won, and Hamas turned around and threw them out. And they've been in power since. So there's more going on. When Janine and I were in Bethlehem many years ago, we were told by our Christian Palestinian tour guide that he was afraid to be in Bethlehem because of Hamas, and that they were being targeted by the terrorists. So I want to believe that the majority of the Palestinians in the West Bank want just what you and I want: to live our lives with our children, with our grandchildren, and ensure that our descendants will prosper and have their own families in peace and not have to run for bomb shelters. When a siren goes off and you have 15 to 60 seconds to find shelter, which I personally experienced in 2006, as I mentioned. There's a question here about, can you comment on Kerry's sharing of with Iran confidential Israeli information? I don't really have enough, what I read is in the paper. I'm not connected, and David's not connected with the Israeli government, so I don't really feel comfortable responding to that question. We're going to wrap this up, and I just want to share there's one more question. What can we as individuals do? I'm going to address it right now. Again, I thank everyone for joining us. We've had a tremendous response and a tremendous audience. Our purpose tonight was to provide you with the information and facts so that when you're asked by your children or your grandchildren or your neighbor, Jewish or non-Jewish, what is going on? Hopefully you'll be able to at least put a doubt in their mind when they say, Look at the pictures on CNN. Look at the pictures on Fox. Look on MSNBC, New York Times, whatever it is you want to point to. And they go, the buildings are collapsing, children are dying. We all agree it's a terrible thing to be happening. But Israel didn't start this war. Israel didn't launch the first rockets. And there's a history to this. And as David so beautifully explained, Israel is, and we, the world, are up against terrorist organizations whose goal is the eradication of the state of Israel. And I will give you a firsthand experience. The Palestinians had a rally in Dallas, Texas last Saturday. I've been to every Palestinian rally in Dallas since they had them. I always try and get my wife to go, but she always finds something else to do. This rally Saturday easily had over 2,000 people. And the thing that was unusual was that it was raucous and it was festive. Cars were honking and motorcycles were revving their engines and the people were almost celebrating. And I don't understand what they were celebrating. They were not mournful of the deaths that are occurring among their own people, because I believe that a vast majority, maybe 90% of the people there were Palestinian Arab because of their dress, because they were speaking Arabic, because of the color of their skin, just darker, Middle Eastern, driving around in their Mercedes and their BMWs and their expensive cars. It was odd to me. A war is going on, people are dying, and they're celebrating. We have a challenge. But we have a mission. We have a mission to bring peace and security to Israel, and I'm sorry, to the world. And it's not enough to say, I don't understand, so I'm not going to pay attention. You have to pay attention. What you read in the paper, just read it with sort of a jaundiced point of view, and know that the writer of the article has a certain goal that they're trying to get you to subconsciously see, but it's not on the editorial page. Resources. Now we'll get into some of those concluding. There are many, many resources that you can find. They're all very good. The ones that I have been following recently during the last 10 days, I'll share with you. One is AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. I think they've been doing an excellent job of keeping us informed and telling the story as it is. The American Jewish Committee, or AJC, I also think, and I commend David Harris and the AJC people for getting out in front, calling it as it is. There's a daily publication called Daily Alert, which is put out by the presidents of major Jewish organizations that basically summarizes articles from all over the world about Israel and Jews and related topics. You can read the summary and then you can click and go to the article. I highly recommend an English language Israeli news station called I-24. They have an app. It's a small fee to pay. And during their business hours, which keep in mind, they're 8 hours ahead, and for sometimes longer during the day, they give you on the ground reporting of what's actually happening in Israel. Not through CNN, not through the New York Times, not through Fox. It's Israelis. And they talk about topics that are important to us, and it's in English. The Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs is a good source. The organization Stand With Us is excellent, not only for their reporting on what's happening, but because of the information and booklets that they have available explaining a wide range of topics from anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, Hamas, just everything that really is important, and a periodical called Times of Israel. On the other side, if you want to read a source from what the Palestinian side is saying, I can suggest to you the Palestine News Network. And you'll see the other side, and you should read the other side. The reason why I go to the Palestinian rallies is because I want to hear what the other side is saying. If you want to try and, so the question is, what can I do? All right, I'll tell you. You can talk to your children, your grandchildren, your friends, your neighbors, etc. Go to these sources I've told you. Read what they're saying. And at least when someone asks you what's going on, try to give them that basic information that says Israel is in a war with terrorist organizations whose basic charter calls for their destruction and killing. As hard as it is to say that, go read the Hamas charter on the internet, go read the PLO charter for yourself. It's not propaganda, it is translated into English, and it is what it says. And if you find somewhere on the internet that says that the Palestinian Authority has canceled their charter, well, that's a little play on words, because the charter is the charter of the Palestine Liberation Organization. It's not the charter of the PA. So just read it for yourself. Go read the Hezbollah. Hezbollah calls for the same thing. If you want to make a donation, now to help the victims of terror, the people whose homes have been hit by rockets, and actually, when a Iron Dome missile hits a rocket, that's the good news. They both explode. The bad news is that the body of the rocket and the missile explode, and they fall to the earth. And sometimes that causes damage. If you want to make a donation to actually help people, go to www.jafina.org. It's the organization I'm on the board of. That's a sister organization to the Jewish Agency. Jafina is a U.S. organization. The money you give, when you go to that page, click on donations, go to Crisis in Israel, and click on the amount you want to pledge. Whether it's $25 or $25,000. I was on a call this morning with members of Jaffe in Israel and here. The money is needed, whether for medical reasons, for repairs, for rebuilding of property, it is needed. And when this war is over, Gaza is going to need help to rebuild. And the world will come to their aid. But hopefully Hamas will be weakened to the point that they won't be able to strike for years. Form what we call Hezbollah groups, not Hezbollah, Hasbara groups. Sorry, Hasbara, friends. And if you want someone to help facilitate the talk, call me. I'll come. I'll come in person. I don't care where you are, out of town. You want to do it by Zoom? I'll come, we'll do it by Zoom. I've had requests already. And finally, I'll leave you with something that Rabbi Sachs of blessed memory said. He was the former chief rabbi of England. He said in one of his books that optimism is the belief that things will get better. Hopefulness is the knowledge that if we work together, we will make it better. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be hopeful. We are going to work together. Don't be distracted by the chatter, by the accusations, by the screaming in the Palestinian rallies, by what you read in social media. I have mentioned to my friends in Israel that in this media propaganda war, which we're in, we need to be as creative and thinking out of the box as the Iron Dome. We need to develop our own Iron Dome to counter the lies and the hatred that is being spread in social media against Israel, against Jews, and against others that support Israel. I don't have the answer, but we got to develop our Iron Dome. And the Iron Dome, as you know, has been 90% effective at knocking rockets out. We got to develop that to knock this out and put it to bed. But I think it's going to get more tough and we have more challenges. So stay with us. We appreciate your attention. Once again, I want to thank Nishmatam for hosting David and I tonight. This program is going to be recorded. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, if they're nice, send it to me. If they're not, send it to David. Send it to Nishmatam. And if we can, we'll respond to you. And again, if you want to get a group of people together to talk, I'll go. And I think I could probably get David to come with me because we have to stick together. If we're not unified, we'll fail. Thank you very much. Lila Tov.
Lauren, are we on?